Deep in the Reads here, and today I'm reviewing one of those books where reading it feels like you're finally getting in on this conversation that everybody's been having, because everyone's already read the thing and they all have very strong opinions on it one way or the other. And that book is, of course, Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, one of the most famous novels in American literature, very influential in tapping into that teen angst that would crop up in a lot of the counterculture movements of the 50s and 60s. Although, like I've mentioned, this is a very polarizing book, and part of the reason for that, I think, is because this is one of those books that's constantly being assigned reading and forced down students' throats in high school and stuff. And I can definitely say that if I had been forced to read this when I was a teenager, I would have absolutely hated it, but as it stands, I just read it for the first time, and I actually really enjoyed it. The book is about this teenager named Holden Caulfield who gets expelled from his 4th prep school in a row just before Christmas break, and he decides to spend the last of his money for a few days in New York City before he goes home to face the wrath of his parents for being expelled. He writes in a stream of consciousness, first-person style, so you get to hear all of his thoughts as he rants and dismisses everything from women to jazz music to religion, just on and on, complaining basically about everything, as he's trying to find someone or something to care about while meandering through the city. And a lot of the things that people criticize this book for, if they hate it, are the things that the book is intentionally trying to get across. You know, they say, oh, I can't stand Holden Caulfield, he's arrogant, he's misogynistic, he was born with a silver spoon up his ass, but he keeps complaining about everything. And they're completely right about all of those things. So the question becomes, why would I want to spend 300 pages with a self-absorbed teenager whining all the time? Well, first of all, I don't think that every book needs to have a protagonist that you can envision yourself being best friends with. And it's not as if J.D. Salinger is writing this trying to make you think that Holden is a really cool guy or anything. He knows how Holden comes across. So as I read, I became less interested in how Holden wants to be perceived, and more interested in the facade he's putting up, and all of these little insecurities that he's hiding beneath his caustic personality. Holden is constantly raging against what he calls the phonies, people who are just really insincere or playing a role for themselves. But Holden is the most phony out of everybody because he's constantly telling lies to people, he's putting up barriers and constructing this persona for himself as a way of distancing himself from everyone else, including the reader. He tries to come off as really mature and put together and smarter than everyone else, but he's really juvenile, and some of the stuff he doesn't know shows how young he is. Like, he keeps wondering, where do the ducks go in wintertime? Like a little kid would. Salinger is great at using the prose to really commit to the character of Holden. He writes exactly how you would expect an edgy, pretentious teenager to write, right down to the repetitive phrases, the limited vocabulary, and constantly going off on these long tangents about some random stuff in his past or something he doesn't like or whatever. But the writing also lends itself to a lot of humor because of how hyperbolic, how flippant, and how dismissive Holden is about, like, everything around him. So I'll just give you a little example from when he goes into a jazz bar. He says, I'm not too sure what the name of the song was that he was playing when I came in, but whatever it was, he was really stinking it up. He was putting all these dumb, show-offy ripples in the high notes, and a lot of other very tricky stuff that gives me a pain in the ass. You should have heard the crowd, though, when he was finished. You would have puked. They went mad. They were exactly the same morons that like to laugh like hyenas in the movies, that stuff that isn't funny. If I were a piano player, I'd play it in the goddamn closet. The book gives you early hints as to why Holden might be the way that he is. You learn from the first pages of the book that his favorite sibling died when he was younger and he clearly still hasn't processed it. And he's alienated from his surviving family members because they've sent him away to 4 boarding schools now. There's also the fact that a lot of people in his life kind of mirror the same behaviors that Holden does, so you get the sense that he's learned from his environment to be the cynical person that he is, because through his eyes, the world is full of people who are jaded and conceited and are like putting on a show of who they are. But Salinger is pretty clever in the way that just beneath Holden's dumb little complaints about everyone around him, he embeds these really sharp criticisms of society at the time. He lives in a world where a lot of casual violence is just around and even expected of him. Like, for example, like, as a man, he's kind of expected to treat women a certain way. There's a part in the book where he's talking about how, when he's getting kind of frisky with women, they might tell him to stop, and if they do, he will stop. But he beats himself up over this because he's like, oh my god, all the other guys I know, they just go for it. They don't care. They end up getting what they want, even if the girl says no, which is horrifying, obviously. But it gets at the fact that, like, he's beating himself up for not living up to this expectation of how he's supposed to treat people around him. He's not supposed to care what they think. He's not supposed to think about their feelings. It's just about, like, selfish, violating sex, and he clearly wants a connection that's deeper than that. This longing for a connection comes up over and over again throughout the book. At one point, he reminisces about this girl he used to have as a very close friend, and how they would emotionally bond over their trauma and their dysfunctional family lives. But the problem is, everything is fleeting for him. People drift in and out of his life, or sometimes he'll push them away, whether intentionally or not. Unfortunately, he is his own worst enemy when it comes to this kind of thing. In spite of Holden's toxic behavior and attitudes, and in spite of how frustrating it is to watch him attempt to interact with people, I found myself feeling sorry for him, and as the book went on, I was really rooting for him to find something to connect with, or at least find a frickin' hobby or something. But then you start to see him interacting with his younger sister Phoebe, and she seems to be the only person who can pull him out of his self-protective, cynical shell. The nihilistic veil over the whole book lifts when he's around her, and you end up getting some genuinely heartwarming moments. He seems to really like most kids, and it is because that he is aware of their innocence and their naivete and how it kind of frees them from the harsh reality of the world. But he's very aware at how fleeting this innocence is, and how eventually all kids are going to end up jaded and cynical, just like he is, but he hates to see it. At one point he's at an elementary school and there's like swear words scratched into the wall, and it really upsets him because he sees it as like impugning on a kid's innocence and making the world a dirtier place for them. But the irony is that he is part of the problem, because he swears a blue streak all throughout the book, including in front of his sister, who keeps, like, scolding him for it. These sorts of contradictions and encounters are what Holden grapples with throughout the book, and it leads to a surprisingly cathartic ending that I thought was quite powerful. I even got a little bit choked up at the end. But if you aren't picking up what this book is putting down, then you're probably going to find the ending to be quite jarring and even random. So again, this is one of those books where it really depends on the attitude you're bringing in with you. And that's not to say it's a difficult book or anything, because it's really not that hard to see the bundle of contradictions that Holden is, and how that bundle of contradictions is hurting him and everybody around him. So yeah, give this book a shot. I would definitely recommend it. If you do read this book, I'll be rooting for you to look past your prejudices in the same way I was rooting for Holden Caulfield to look past his. I thought this was a great coming-of-age story and a good commentary on modern alienation. If you're willing to work with it a little bit, I think you'll get a lot out of it as well. I would give it 8 out of 10, so yeah, definitely a recommend. And now that I have entered my argument in favor of this book, it's time for you to participate in the same discussion. If you've read this book, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Did you hate it? Did you love it? Were you assigned it in school? I'm curious about that. But I guess I'll leave it there. I could have talked much more about this. Maybe we can do that in the comments, I don't know, but I'll leave it there. So I guess I'll see you whenever my next time is. Toodles!